I want to thank you first, before I get started, for inviting me and my family to be here with you guys and to worship with you guys and minister with you guys. So it's an honor for me to be here, and I just want to thank you before I even get started. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to be in 2 Kings a lot, but I'm going to start out in 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, verse 15 is my favorite verse. It says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for you for the reason of the hope that you have, yet do so with gentleness and kindness." Some say respect. That's one of my favorite verses because it reminds me of who I really am, who I am in Christ, and what my story is, what my testimony is, but also how we do that, right? We do that with gentleness and respect, with kindness. I think sometimes, so often we forget that. We see that in our culture a lot today. We forget that part of it. I'm going to pray with us, and I'm going to get started. God, I thank you so much. Lord, I just praise you first and foremost because you are worthy of all the honor and glory. That we would have nothing, would be nothing without you, Lord. I thank you for allowing me to be in this place today. In your presence, Lord, have your will in my life. Speak your words through me and help me to be a blessing. And I just thank you for this time. We just praise your holy name in Jesus' name. Amen. You talk a lot about summer, and that's kind of what I thought about as I was preparing for today. Summertime is so important, I believe, in ministry, especially in student ministry. This is the time of the year where it is kind of sad, right? We're closing this chapter, but we're opening another one. And sometimes change is hard because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, right? But God is preparing us even today for what he has for tomorrow. So this is kind of my end of the year. I kind of look at the end of the summer as my end. So I look at the previous year, how it went, because now students are going off to college. Newer ones are coming up into the student ministry. And so I kind of make an evaluation of what did I not like about this previous year and what I want to see different. And I just pray about that, and I begin to make goals and set things long term, what I want it to look like, so that I can change things as the year goes along to meet those goals. Because I believe God directs our steps, but he also has the expectation that we're going to work hard and do exactly what he's called us and equipped us to do. So as the summer comes to an end, I reflect back and I look at this summer. And I don't know about you, but I kind of live through summers. Summertime to me is my favorite time of the year. It's usually when you spend time with your families. You plan all year for your vacations. If you're a teacher or things like that, typically you have that time off. And it's also a time with less distraction. The fall is taken up by fall sports and band and all those kind of things. And it's a time in ministry where you can do a lot of good, a lot of community, a lot of relationship building. And I really enjoy this summer. And this summer, I took kids to Somersault. I don't know if you're familiar with that camp, but it's through the convention. It's an awesome camp. I've tried others. I always go back because, to me, it's the best one out there. And every year they do a theme. And this year's theme was my story. What's your story? And it kind of impacted me, and it kind of set how I was do ministry this summer. And they said that when they would interview staffers, which are college students, to come in and be a part of Somersault and to lead the students that are coming, they would ask them, "What's your testimony?" And overwhelmingly, most of them didn't have one. All these college students are coming in. They're literally applying to pour into the lives of other believers to teach biblical principles, and they don't have a testimony. They'd say things like, my parents, I go to church because my parents go to church. Those kind of things like that. So the whole week was built around, what is your story? What is your testimony? Who are you? Who is he? What you believe about him dictates what you believe about yourself. What is your story? And I was just so impacted by that. And so obviously you don't know me, so I wanted to give you a little bit of my story. So some years ago, I went to a little country church, and it wasn't, they didn't really have a youth group or anything like that. They didn't have, it was basically, we were all together. And I met my wife when we were teenagers, and she invited me to her church. It just happened to be a Baptist church. And I discovered there was a different world that I didn't know about. They sang songs that weren't necessarily in a hymn book. They had a student pastor, and he poured into my life, and he's still a good friend to me today. I just spoke to him the other day. And I got saved through that ministry, and my life changed through that ministry. A few years later, I just began to realize that I was feeling a lot of depression about where I was supposed to be. I knew being saved that there was something more required of me. I had some purpose that I didn't know what it was. And I was working at a plant. I started there when I was 19. I actually was working at Bose. I see you have some Bose speakers. I worked there for, I feel like my whole life, but it was 14 years. And for a lot of years, I thought that was what I would always do. I was very good at it. I traveled. I learned a lot about engineering and electronics and things like that. And I just assumed that I would one day retire from there. It was my job in life to support my family. And whether I liked it or not, that was the path I was on. And, I just really began to pray. And for a lot of those last few years I was there, I really began to pray, God, where do you want me to minister? What do you want me to do? I know I'm supposed to be doing something. And one particular day I was sitting in the service, and someone came up to the pulpit, and they said the student pastor was a different guy at the time. He had left, and they had no one to do the youth ministry, and they were looking for volunteers. And they said, we're going to meet in the fellowship hall tonight. If you want to come and meet with us and be a part and help out until we can find somebody, anybody's welcome to come. So I actually went that night. I told my wife, I said, I think this might be what God is calling me to do. Now, for me to say that, you probably don't understand, because God calls the most unlikely people to do the biggest things. I mean, if you read the patriarchs in the Bible, right, we see all these stories of people, people would choose Saul, and then God chooses David, right? The people always choose who we think should lead and who we think should do things. But God has a different picture and a different mind. And he's always going before us, always preparing us for what he has for us, even when we don't know it, even in the times when we feel like it's uncomfortable. So I drove up there that night, and I remember I sat in the parking lot for a good little while. And I remember I just looked at the door, and fear overcame me. I cranked my car up and went back home. And I told my wife, I said, that's not it. That cannot be it. I'm 29 years old. I cannot be relatable to teenagers anymore, not to mention I have no idea what I even say to them. So I made up my mind. I'm not doing it. Long story short, God kept opening this door. I couldn't get away from it, and I finally I said, you know what? I'll go in there just to prove a point that it's not what I'm supposed to be, and then I can write it off and do something different. So I prepared probably 10 pages. My lesson lasted maybe 4 minutes. I just blew through it. I didn't know what I was doing. But those kids is what changed everything. I was so afraid they weren't going to accept me, but it was the exact opposite. And I have these lifelong friendships from there and from the last 12 years of all these different ministries. And it's just been life-changing. I still can't believe it sometimes. I'm still standing here doing ministry in the life of all these different families. I get to do the weddings now and hold the little babies. And, they come up and eat dinner with me all the time. And it's incredible to me. And I can't believe I was so afraid back then, but I had no idea what the future held. And sometimes that can be a scary place. So I'm doing ministry. I'm also still working at this electronics plant. And I just don't know, is this something you have in the season for me, or is this a calling? I don't know. I don't have any form of training. I don't really know exactly what I'm supposed to be really doing. I don't feel equipped to do this. And they called me in the office and said, listen, we appreciate your years of service, but we're moving to Mexico. So here's your severance package. It was nice knowing you. And I remember thinking, God? Who would get mad at first, right? It's got to be God's fault. If God loved me, right? I'm serving you and you take my job away. I have no livelihood. How am I supposed to support my family now? And then God in that moment spoke to me and said, what you been praying for? Just calm down. I got this. It opened the door for me to go to college for free. My old youth pastor called me and said, I have a student-led church. We have 80 teenagers. You want to help me? Sure. Interned with him for a year. And God just kept opening door after door after door. It was unbelievable sometimes how God worked everything out. And as I'm thinking about this and preparing this for you today, I couldn't help but have those mental pictures of those students in those early years. And I thought to myself, I must have done them a disservice. I had no idea what I was doing. You get such a small fraction of time with people, especially kids, until they grow up and move on to a different stage of life. I just get that little bit of time. Did I use it wisely? Did I do them a disservice in that time I had with them? And in that moment, this is unbelievable, in that moment I got a text from an old student. And he says, do you have a minute? I said, absolutely, I have a minute. And he says, he's going in his last year of the Citadel. And he says, it's been a tough couple of years, and I really strayed far from the Lord. And he said, the other day I found a book that you gave me, and we did a study from. And I picked that book back up, and I read it. And he said, it reminded me of the things you taught me. He said, I want to thank you for what you did for me those days because it made such an impact on my life. And I saved it because I want to use it for encouragement. Because sometimes we just forget that those little times that we had with people, the impact that may not seem that big to them was huge in their life. So you never know. You never know the influence you have. And I appreciated that story. But as I was thinking about being unqualified, I thought of this story in 2 Kings. I'm going to spend a lot of time in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 8. I'll give you a second to get there. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. And this story is actually, you probably know it's from the Shunammite woman. I won't read the whole thing. It's pretty long because we're going to go a good bit into it. But I'm just going to pick some portions out. It says, one day, Elijah went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And he said to her husband, behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God who continually passes our way. Let us make a small room for him on the roof with walls and put them a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go there. So this story is great. I see a woman, first of all, we notice right from the beginning she's wealthy, right? She has a lot. So she has the means, she has the resources to what? To meet the needs of somebody else. And that just happened to be Elijah. So these two stories cross, where Elijah needs somewhere to stay, he needs some food, so God meets his need through the Shunammite woman. Now, she didn't have to do that, but she saw an opportunity to be a blessing to someone else. So she did it. I mean, some of us would take somebody in, maybe, and feed them. But how many of us would build a room for them and say, you can stay here anytime you like. Anytime you pass through, I'll provide for you. I mean, talk about an act of service. As I read this story, I think to myself, God is not calling everybody to do this incredible thing. He's not calling everybody to part the Red Sea. But what he is calling us is to use the resources that we have to be a blessing to somebody else right where they are. And that's exactly what she did. She had the means to meet this man's need. In verse 11 it says, one day he came there, and he turned in the chamber, and he rested there, and he said to Gehazi, which is his servant, call the Shunammite. When he called her, she stood before him and said to him, say now to her, see, you have taken all this trouble for us. What could be done for you? Would you have words spoken on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army? She said, I dwell among my own people. Now, so he's looking at this story, and he's looking at her, and he's saying, hey, she's really put herself out for me, right? And in the beginning of the story, she doesn't know that he's a holy man, because it says, later it says, I know now that he is a holy man. She didn't even know who he was, or it doesn't seem that way, right? He's a complete stranger. Now she knows. He says, what can I do for you? What can I do for you to bless you? You bless me, what can I do to bless you? And she basically says, in her own way, she says, I'm content. How many of us, if someone, and this is Elijah, says, what can I do for you? And you can say, I am content. How many of us are content? How many of us can open our closet today and only have one jacket, one pair of shoes, just enough food for our family? We have so much more. We have an abundance. We're so blessed. Sometimes we don't even realize how blessed we are. And how many of us drive past people in need every single day, missing the blessing that God has given us, only because we don't have time? She says, I have everything. I'm content. But we see why. He says, and he said, what then is to be done for her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. He said, call her. And when he called her, she stood in the doorway and said, at this season, by this time next year, you will embrace a son. And she said, no, my Lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. So now we see why. She'd already been hurt. She's already been down that path, and she's already put it behind her. She's already accepted the fact that she's not going to have a child. More than likely, she's already tried, and she doesn't want to deal with the disappointment once again. Please don't get my hopes up again, only to be disappointed again. How many times in our lives do we say those exact same things? I don't want another relationship, God, because the last one ended so badly. I don't want to be disappointed again. So we never go out and do the things God has prepared us to do because we're so afraid of being disappointed yet again, right? And in this story, I mean, I can't imagine what that must be like, right? I'm sure her heart's desire is to have a child. It said, but the woman conceived a son about the time the following spring that Elijah said to her. So this is an incredible story, right? It seems so small and insignificant, right? But here we have, she was a blessing in her own way with the things she had, the location she had, the money she had. She was being a blessing to him. The man of God was being blessed through her. He blessed her. God gave her a son. Wouldn't it be incredible if the story just ended here? That would be amazing, right? It would speak volumes. You know, you can't outgive God, right? You be a blessing, you aren't blessed, right? But the story goes on. It says, when the child had grown, he went out one day with his father among the reapers. And he said to the father, "Oh, my head," the father to his servant, "carry him to his mother." I don't know why, but I find that funny. Who we always run to. Take him to your mama, right? So he says, and he lifted and brought him to his mother, and the child sat in her lap till noon, and he died. He died. Now, a few minutes ago, that's obviously years have passed, but she just said, "Do not get my hopes up. Don't get my hopes up." See? Now, was it worse to not have a child, but have a child and have it die? Now you know what you've lost? Now you've loved it? Man, how many of us can deal with that? How many of us could just walk away and not be angry at God? If God loved me. Is that not a famous last word? If God loved me. How many times do we hear that? If God loved me, he wouldn't allow this to happen to me. Sometimes people would live right here. Never go past this point. They live right here. I'm mad, and I'm going to stay mad. I'm going to be bitter, and I don't care. You gave it to me, and you took it away. The only thing I even care about. The one thing I didn't have. Sometimes we just can't get past it. But she didn't do that. She didn't live that. She knew where her blessing came from, and she knew where to go to get it. She went out and she laid him on the bed. I'm going to jump down a little further. In verse 32, it says, Elijah came to the house. So she runs to Elijah because she knows Elijah was the one who she can count on, right? She knew Elijah served a mighty God. She runs to Elijah. She runs, and the servant stops her. She doesn't let the servant stop her. She says, "I must speak to Elijah." So she goes to Elijah. She says, "That's the son. He's dead. You have to do something." And he says, when Elijah came to the house, he saw the child laying dead on the bed. So he went and he shut the door behind the two men and he prayed to the Lord. Where did he do? He didn't do it. He prayed to the Lord. Then he went up, laid the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands, and he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opens his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi, and he said, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." She came and fell at his feet, bowing at the ground. Then he picked up her son, and he went out. That is an incredible story. An incredible story. I mean, I see this in our lives. I've dealt with so many different people who they don't want things to come alive. They're so bitter. How many of us have a divorce that God right now can fix it? He can bring it back to life. But we're so stubborn. We've already moved on to what we want to do. And we don't want God to bring it back. We don't want God to resurrect it. We just want to live how we want. And just say, forget it. God didn't bless me. I don't want it. I don't want him no more, right? But God has already gone before us. He's already prepared it. He's already prepared you. And here's the beauty of it. Her story doesn't stop here. It would be incredible if it stopped here. She used the resources she had. She helped the man of God. The man of God blessed her. The child died. God brought the son back to life. Now she's got an even bigger testimony. Not to mention she has more appreciation for what she just lost. I mean, it's an incredible story. But it doesn't end there either. If you jump over to 2 Kings chapter 8. 2 Kings chapter 8. It says, "Now Elijah has said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, 'Arise, depart with your household, and sojourn wherever you can.' So the Lord had called a famine, and it will be upon the land for 7 years." So there's going to be a famine. Elijah tells her, says, "Take your family and go." Right? She could have stayed there and suffered not knowing what was coming. But because she blessed Elijah, then years have passed. Years have gone by. And she's still being blessed for something she did years ago. She's just been sheltered from a famine for 7 years, her entire family, because of what she did for Elijah all those years ago. You cannot outgive God. It is impossible to outgive God. God is still going on before you. He heard every one of your prayers, even though you didn't know it. He already has your best interest at heart. He doesn't love by an extension of love. He loves because he is love. He's already loved you more than you can ever imagine. He's never been against you. He's always been for you. In every story, he's working it out for your good. Sometimes we forget that we're not the star of this show. See, we think we are. We think we're the action hero, and the cameras are following us, and everybody around us are supporting actors. What we forget is he's the star of the show, and we're the supporting actors. And if we start to realize that, we'll start to change the way we act and treat each other. That's really the problem. And we also need to understand that it's not one movie that's ours. See, a lot of people like to say, well, this is my life, right? But you don't understand that all of our lives intersect in his big movie, right? My life just intersected with yours. I didn't know anybody in the room, right? I was just invited here. But here we are today in a chance meeting, right? And our lives are intersecting in a larger role, the kingdom of God. And she had no idea what she was getting involved in when she invited Elijah. When Elijah walked through that door, she never could have saw what was coming her way. So she went and arose and did according to what the man of God had said. She went out of her household in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. It says in verse 3, it says, at the end of those 7 years, when the woman returned from the land, she went back to appeal to the king for her house and her land. So she's been gone 7 years. She's lost everything. Now remember in the beginning of the story, she's a wealthy person. She was content. Now she has nothing. So she goes to the king, and she's going to petition the king. She says, and before she can even get there, before she can say a word, guess who's already there? Gehazi, the servant of Elijah, is already there. And he says, tell me some of those amazing stories of Elijah, right? And he says, okay, there was this woman, and Elijah raised her son from the dead. And she's right there. When she walked into the throne, the king has already heard her story because God had already gone on before her. Her reputation had already preceded her. Elijah's reputation had already preceded her. He was already working it out for her good before she even stepped into the door. She didn't even have to say a word. All because she blessed Elijah all those years ago. Now that tells me one thing. Your reputation does precede you. The question is, what is your reputation? That's a big question. Elijah's reputation definitely preceded him. They were talking about him. But hers, she was part of the story too. And they were talking about her. And because of what she had done, because of their story, the king said, give her everything back with interest. He literally says, restore all that was hers together with all the produce of the fields from the day she left until now. For 7 years, they're going to give her all that. Not to mention everything she had back. Now that is a good story. What's your story? See, all of our lives are intersecting. You don't know what's tomorrow. You know, we just talked about summer, right? We don't know what the next chapter is. Sometimes we have no clue where we'll be. I had one of those experiences a few weeks ago. My wife, she's friends with a lady who does a ministry out of Columbia, and they had a big prayer breakfast at the Capitol. So I was just going to support her, and we went up on the 25th floor, and we're overlooking the Capitol and downtown Columbia, and there's representatives from every district there, and they're all praying for schools, for teachers, for the students, for everybody involved for this year. And it's her mission to get prayer in school, and it's just this incredible experience. And everybody's praying. I just remember being, I met people. I had a guy come up to me and pray, did not know who I was, but literally he stopped me going on the elevator, and he prayed, and he spoke over me and my wife things he would never even know. It was just incredible. And when the prayer breakfast was over, we went down to the State House, to the steps, and they had set up a praise and worship band, and they were just singing and praising God. And I knew my wife was going to speak, so I was prepared to just record her. And the lady who's running it, she walks over, she hands me a piece of paper and says, "This is what you'll be talking about." I'm sorry, what? I was just here to support her and just record. I was just going to sit over there. And she said, "When you just say, I think she said, edify the church." And I looked at my wife and I said, "What does she want me to say?" And she says, I don't know. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I'm sitting there, and she calls me up. So I'm sitting up on the steps, and there's incredible worship going on. And I prayed. I said, "God, I need two things from you right now. One, please don't let me stutter. And two, you got to tell me what to say. I don't know what to say." So in that, I'm watching, right, as the worship is going on. And I'm looking around, and I see college students from USC walking, and he sits here, and his eyes are closed, and he's praying. I see off in the distance, I see a woman praying at a park bench, and I see people just coming and listening everywhere. And then not even a block away, they're doing this thing called Soda City. If you're not familiar with it, it's like a food truck thing, and there's thousands of people down there. And I remembered a few years back, my grandfather had died, and we were at his funeral. And a childhood friend of mine who's now a pastor, he did the service, and he preached the gospel. And it was amazing. I remember leaving the funeral thinking, when it's my time, please don't say a word about me. Just preach Jesus. Just preach Jesus. It was amazing. And the next day, I wanted to remember my grandfather, and I opened the obituary on the state newspaper on the internet, and I was just reading through the different stories. And the story caught me by, I looked at it, and it said, "You don't know me." And he said, "I wasn't at the funeral, but I lived behind the cemetery." And he said, in that moment yesterday, I cried out to God. I said, "God, if you're real, prove it to me right now. Let me hear from you, God." And he said, "Out my window, I heard your grandfather's funeral, and I heard that preacher tell about how it was all about Jesus, and turned to him now." And he said he fell down on his kitchen floor and he accepted Christ from hearing that funeral. And I thought about that as I was sitting on those steps, and I thought to myself, all I want him to hear is Jesus. It's all that really matters. They don't need to know who I am. So when they handed me the mic, I just started preaching about Jesus. I don't know, and when I got done, I don't really know what I said. But I know there were a lot of people there that could hear it. Actually, my wife said when we were leaving, she spoke to a woman that had walked down to Soda City, and she said, "I could hear y'all down there. I had to come down here and see what was going on." And she was actually visiting from the Bahamas. Sometimes God chooses the most unlikely people, and he brings you to the most unlikely place to be a blessing to the most unlikely people that you don't even know. You don't know what God is doing. You don't know where he's preparing you to go. But I tell you this, he's already gone on before you, and he's already set your path. He's already preparing you today for what he needs you to do tomorrow, to be a blessing. To be a blessing. So when our stories intertwine with his, we can glorify him in it. It's a beautiful picture if we really look at it. I don't know where our stories are going to bring us tomorrow, but I'm hopeful and I'm faithful that God has already set it for us. So tomorrow's a clean slate. The question is what you're going to do with that tomorrow. Are you going to look for an opportunity to serve and be a blessing when you go to school for the first time, maybe whatever grade you're going into, or maybe you're a teacher, or maybe you don't even know what tomorrow's going to bring. Maybe you have a relationship that you think is broken. Maybe you're broken. Maybe you have some things you need a God-sized miracle in. Maybe God's calling you to do something incredible, and you're just looking for affirmation that, yeah. One of my favorite things in the whole Bible is when Jeremiah says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." He's looking for that. Obedient people willing to step out on faith and work. Hey, I want to thank you for having me here today. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Pastor, for the invitation.